So hello and welcome to this meeting, the second meeting of three meetings that's a series of meetings that's focusing on selling produce from your farm, croft or smallholding. Last week we discussed the topic of marketing, which was very successful, very well attended. And this week we're hoping to explore a bit more about the principles of breeding and managing stock in order to get the best possible meat for your scenario or your setting. And what we'll do is we've got a couple of speakers today from QMS. So I'll introduce you to Beth Alexander and Bruce McConaughey, who will take you through the first section of this meeting. And they will talk a bit about what QMS are doing. And they've got a presentation that they showed at, it was Agri-Scott, if I'm right. And that'll just sort of stimulate some ideas and things like that you might want to think about your own setting. And then what we'll do is we'll open up. We have Nicola Lamb from SEC. It's Curtin unit, is it, Nicola? Are you based at? No audio, right? Okay, hopefully we'll have that sorted before. So we have Nicola Lamb as well, who will open up to questions, and she can direct a lot of the more technical elements of things as well. So I'll hand you over now to Beth and Bruce, who will take you through the first part of this meeting. And please, just any questions, bring them through. Thanks. Over to you guys. Okay, so what we're going to do is run through the topic of basically, as you touched on, as Rob touched on, maximizing returns through hit and spec, basically, which is making sure that your animal is right for the market you're aiming at, and how we've developed a program that can hopefully help with that. So if you look at the agenda, it gives a sort of summary of what we're looking to do tonight and what we're looking to rattle through. If you go to the next slide, Beth. There we go. So yeah, we're going to just have a bit of an introduction, set the scene, show you essentially what we've done, why we've done it, and how you can utilize it for your business. If we go to the next one. So just by way of an introduction, my name is Bruce McConaughey. I'm the head of industry development, and I've got a background in beef and sheep farming before I moved to QMS. And I work with Beth. Beth's our cattle and sheep specialist, one of our cattle and sheep specialists. And what industry development does at QMS is essentially product development for the red meat sector. And we work across all three species, beef, lamb, and pork. So what we're focused on essentially is improving efficiency of farm businesses, improving the sustainability of farm businesses, and promoting best practice and innovative technologies. So the industry development department is obviously producer facing, so we'll work a lot with farmers and producers. We work across the rest of the supply chain though, so that's a good illustration as to where our levy members come from. There's over 10,000 members across all the schemes. Obviously, the most dominant one is the cattle and sheep members that are nearly 10,000 in number. But we've also got the specially selected pork brand, the haulage scheme, processor scheme, auction marts, haulage. So we're covering the entire food chain pretty effectively, and it's important that we get that point out there and show that we're trying to fit into a larger industry and trying to make sure that everything we do has got industry buy-in from every sector. If we go to the next slide. So within Quality Meat Scotland, the industry development team obviously sits in the develop element of Quality Meat Scotland's work. So as I said, what we're trying to do is we're trying to be primarily producer facing, about improving businesses, about improving profitability, sustainability, and efficiency of different farm businesses. And we're doing that through various programs. And these are some of the more high level programs that you will almost definitely be aware of, particularly the Monitor Farms. We're in the middle of the Monitor Farm Legacy project and hoping that next year we can get up and running with a new round of the Monitor Farm Scotland programme, which I'm sure you've all been aware of for a number of years. As well as that, we've got the Sustainable Red Meat Action Groups, which are a group that's being put together by our other cattle and sheep specialist, John Evans, and it's really focused on establishing what sustainability looks like without the economic side of things. So looking purely at the environmental and carbon and emission sustainability end of farm production. And in the middle there, we've got our Meet the Market workshops, which Beth will go on to explain a little bit more about in much better detail, because she's really the brains behind that element of our work.
Over to you, Beth.
Thanks, Bruce. So what does our Meet the Market programme look to do? We aim to work alongside processors to give farmers, auctioneers, butchers, chefs, and other stakeholders valuable market-driven insights to stock selection, carcass specification, and grading techniques. We're aiming to enhance skills and knowledge in this area to increase the amount of in-specification stock being sent to slaughter. Different stakeholders in the supply chain have different requirements, so we look to tailor the workshops to the specific group, whether they be farmers or butchers, for example. If it was a commercial environment, as Bruce touched on, we might call this product development. So we're trying to enhance the knowledge to meet consumers' needs. In 2018, approximately 60% of lambs and 70 to 80% of cattle met market specifications, meaning a large proportion of livestock failed to meet specifications, with overfat or overweight carcasses being the two most common reasons for stock to be out of spec. When we're talking about specification for lamb, we're talking about an EU or R grade for confirmation and a 2 and 3L for fat, and up to 21 kilos dead weight, with a large number of processors not paying for any weight past that 21 kilos. For cattle, again, an EU or R grade for confirmation and a 2, 3 and 4L for fat, with many processors inflicting penalties for carcasses over 420 kilos dead weight. Some have actually reduced this to 400 kilos dead weight now. However, it depends on how, when and where you're marketing your livestock. So the aim of the Meet the Market workshops is to highlight this to farmers and give practical guidance on selecting stock for slaughter. These workshops follow 6 to 8 lambs or cattle from the layerage through to the carcass on the hook. We run all these workshops with Adrian Crowe and George Allen from Meat and Livestock Commercial Services Limited. NLCSL is the only independent provider of abattoir authentication and classification services to the British processing industry. And the pictures here is Adrian Crowe holding a lamb for some of the handling techniques, and then following that through to carcass. So firstly, on the workshops, we handle the stock in the layerage and ask attendees to guess the confirmation, fat and weight of the animal. And then we follow this through and see how the animal kills out. It's a really unique opportunity to closely follow livestock over the scale in the abattoir and really understand what we're looking for when selecting stock for slaughter. We had 20 Meet the Market workshops planned for 2020 and 2021, but the arrival of COVID-19 meant all face-to-face meetings have been suspended. So this sparked us to think how we bring a theme of work into the virtual world. We had noticed before lockdown, back this time last year, that there was a gap between the physical workshops and then the producers going back home to put some of the tips they'd put into practice. So COVID-19 really drove the need for this an online grading tool, and it's led us to launch our new Meet the Grade tool. The Meet the Grade tool offers virtual models of cattle and sheep to demonstrate the differences between carcass grades from the farm office. It highlights assessment points and handling points to look out for fat and confirmation, as well as some practical tips on presentation of livestock at an abattoir. So I'll just share my screen to show you the tool. Okay. Can I check that you can see our web page? Brilliant. So carcass classification is a means of describing beef and sheep carcasses in terms that indicate the suitability and the value of a carcass for a particular end use. And it's a universal description. So an R4L in Italy is the same as an R4L in Scotland. So if we go into our introduction to beef carcass classification, When a carcass is classified, the conformation is always given first. Conformation of a carcass is described during Europe. So we have our Europe grid here with conformation on the left-hand side and the fat class along the horizontal axis here. Conformation of describes the shape of the carcass. So when if we look at the photo here where my mouse is, and hopefully you can see my mouse, we split it into three. So we've got the legs, the loin, and the shoulder. The profiles, we've got a conformation R carcass here. So if we look at the legs, we can see the profiles here are straight, fairly straight. There's some flesh over the loin and there's flesh over the shoulder. Not a great depth of flesh, but there is a good covering there. Each part of the carcass is graded individually. So we then take the best two out of three. So say the legs were awarded a R grade, the loin was awarded an O grade, and the shoulder an R. It's the best 2 out of 3, so that carcass gets an R grade. If we look quickly at different conformations, we've got a U, and we start to see these leg profiles become more convex. And there is more width over the loin and again over the shoulder. If you put your hand over that carcass, you'd really begin to struggle to span that the loin and the shoulder. Again, with an E, we become even more rounded and even more full of flesh. And as we move down to an O, we can see the flesh starts to fall away over the shoulder, the legs start to become concave. Once we have awarded a carcass with a conformation grade, it's then given a fat class. So in this photo here, we can see the fat class. This carcass has an average fat cover. The flesh is covered is fat except on the legs and the shoulder. And there's slight deposits of fat through the thoracic cavity, so that's in here. But you can still see the muscle within the ribs. So that's been given an average cover of fat, which is a 3. Obviously, the grid is expanded even further to include upper and lower classes in the 3, 4, and H categories. But we have just minimalized this grid just to show a good representation of each fat class. The colours on the grid also highlight demand for grades. So we've got a colour key here, with the highest demand being for the centre grades here with the white, and lower demand around the periphery of the grid. So we see the carcass, but how do we determine this in a live animal? There are specific handling points for fat and for conformation. So we've popped these handling points onto a live animal, and we have, for fat, the brisket, ribs, and dock are the main handling points. And for conformation, it's those same 3 points that we awarded the conformation for Europe. So it's the legs, the loin, and the shoulder for conformation. And just with lamb, it's the same. We have the legs, the loin, and the shoulder for conformation, and brisket, ribs, and dock for fat. When we're going to handle these lambs, say if you're drawing lambs for slaughter, many people just handle the back and span the back to see if there's a good fat cover. But there's actually more areas that we can look for fat buildup. The dock is a key one. If you feel the dock, if you can feel the bones, or well, if you can't feel the bones, there's a good covering of fat, and generally that fat is right through the lamb. Also, you can gently feel the ribs. You have to be careful not to bruise lambs when you're handling them, but we can gently feel the ribs to see how prominent those ribs are. The brisket's not as good as an indicator in lambs as it is in cattle, but often lambs build up a little pocket of fat just behind the shoulder. So if there's some sponginess there, usually there's a good covering of fat on that lamb. And when we're handling cattle, it's really important to handle on the left-hand side of the beast. This is the loose side, it gets called, because the kidney knobs hang free. On the right-hand side, the kidney knobs are attached to the loin, so it can give you a misrepresentation of how full flesh that loin is. So that's really important. It is easier to see fat buildup on cattle with the eye. You can see it around the dock and you see the brisket getting deeper and wider. But I would really encourage getting a hand on them if it is possible to do so safely, to have a feel over the ribs and on the loin. So to show how conformation and fat changes on the live animal, we have developed some virtual models. And we've taken those same handling points that we just discussed and put them into a virtual model to show how conformation changes and how fat changes. So we've got conformation first. We've got the E, U, R, O, and P. And we've just taken a 4L for fat right the way through to give an average all the way through. So as you can see on the P, the spinal process is really prominent and the legs are really concave. The shoulder, if you put your hand over the shoulder on the carcass, you'd be able to form a V with your hand over the shoulder. But as that conformation grows, you can see the spinal process starts to disappear. The legs become more fuller and rounder, and the shoulder widens and thickens. And for fat, we've taken an R for average all the way through for the fat. We take it down to a 1. We can watch how it builds. The fat builds around the tail and the ribs become less prominent and that brisket really widens and deepens. And we've got the same for lambs as well here. So we can see how that dock becomes fatter. The ribs become less prominent and that brisket starts to widen and deepen. Then we've put all these handling points together and put them into a live animal, well, a full virtual animal, not a live animal. And we selected some representative grapes from the Europe grid just to show how that animal changes right across the grid. So if we start down at an R2, we can see the ribs here and we can see little fat build up on that dock. If we move up to a 5, the ribs, you can no longer see the ribs, and that dock is really, that tail's a really fat tail. And conformation, we can see those legs become convex and the loin is full of flesh, as is the shoulder. And we've done the same for cattle as well. So there's a lot of other areas we've covered in our virtual tool. So I really would encourage everybody to go on and have a look and let us know what you think. We have a feedback button as well that we're really keen on having feedback. It's a new tool, so we want to develop it as best possible. Another thing to note is when selecting animals for slaughter, it's important to handle for conformation and fat cover, but weight's another factor to consider. Any farmer will know their stock better than anyone else. You will begin to build a better understanding of how they kill out when if you're weighing them before you're sending them to slaughter, and then it allows you to marry up that the kill sheet you get back and know what weight to draw at for live weight, whether that's 40 kilos for lambs or 42 kilos. So I'll just share my presentation again. So the key learning that underpins the Meet the Market workshop days is knowing your customer. It's important to know where your customer's demand lies on the Europe grid. Your customer is not always the end consumer though. So if you're selling to a local butcher, it may be that they want a smaller cattle carcass with more fat laid down to keep that fresher for longer, the meat fresher for longer. Or if you sell your finished stock deadweight to an abattoir, it's important to know what their requirements are. An export abattoir will want a lighter and leaner carcass, for example, a 16 kilo R2 lamb, whereas a supermarket abattoir will want a fairly lean carcass, but many pay up to 21 kilos deadweight, but a lot don't pay past this, and 400 kilos for cattle. If you're marketing your own stock and selling direct to the consumer, carcass balance is very important. It's easy to sell steaks and mince, but often difficult to sell larger roasting joints. So again, finding the right size of carcass and fat cover is very important. However, not everyone takes their stock through to finish. A store producer once said to me, the best compliment they receive from a finisher is that they've come back to buy their stock again. So improving communication between your customer is really important so you can maximize returns for your product. Ultimately, each stage in this supply chain has different requirements. Working in collaboration to help make informed choices when it comes to breeding, rearing, finishing, and marketing of livestock is really important. And finally, just on the tool, there are some areas that we still want to develop the tools. We want to link it into our QMS standards and enforce it with some practical demonstration videos, such as carcass classification and live handling. And we want to add in some more information on carcass cuts and meat eating quality. But we really want this tool to be useful for producers. So I'm really focused on demand-led development. So that's where we're looking for as much feedback as possible to look for other areas that we can strengthen the tool to make it as effective and useful as possible. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. That was I didn't know that tool existed actually, and I know you said it was shown at Agri Scott, and I'm kind of disappointed I missed it because I could have been using with that myself at some point. So I think that this is a perfect opportunity to open up for questions just now. I have a few myself. So please, you know, if you want to ask a question just now, there's the raise hand function. Just click on that; it'll flag up, and we'll be able to unmute you, and you can ask your questions away. Or if you're more comfortable using the chat box, please do. We've also got Nicola Lamb as well coming in, so that you know if you've got technical questions and things like that as well, please direct some there. I'll start with a question myself. So I have some sheep of my own, and we're going to sell them fat, but at the moment they're just not putting on weight as much as we would like. So I think the question that I've got is if my stock are not getting to the specified target weight or the confirmation that we want them to get to in time, how do you sort of course correct, and how long does that take to course correct? When should I start thinking about that really prior to selling?
Well, I'm happy to take that. It's a question with a lot of answers, I presume. Yes. I suppose instinctively it's down to your business model and how you can effectively maximize or optimize your margin on those animals. And if it's a case of getting rid of them earlier or persevering and you know, pushing them a little less or pushing them a little more, it all depends on what suits your business model and what's right for your business model. And the great thing and the frustrating thing about Scottish agriculture is there are, you know, at least 100 different breeds, thousands of different cross breeds, and hundreds of different systems in operation. So flexibility is key, and finding and adapting to the system that suits your stock and your ground the best is probably something that's a bit trial and error, to be honest. We're sorry, that's a bit of a vague answer, but
no, that's all right. It's kind of what we expected. It's just Yeah, I mean, the scenario that we have is it's rough ground. It's not good grazing at all. It's primarily a wetland actually, and we are feeding draft and sugar beet mix for these lambs, and they're fine, but they're just not putting on as much weight as fast as we would have hoped.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps it's due to the weather, perhaps it's due to the harsher climate that we've had at the moment. But it's just interesting to see what would be the go-to response in order to course correct. And like you say, that it's a vague answer, but it's a vague question, I suppose, really, isn't it?
I think at the start of the season, it's the other problem, isn't it? We always think your lambs, you've got 2 weeks, you maybe draw them again, and they've just shot off in that 2 weeks, and then you've got lambs which are past it almost. So
yeah, it's
a live animal, isn't it? You can't predict how they're going to grow 1 week to the next. The weather, I think, will be playing a huge part right now, won't it? So it's frustrating as a producer because you want to try and be consistent as possible, but it's a live animal, isn't it, that really holds us back on that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a balancing act. We've got some questions coming in now. That's perfect. Sam Brook is asking, where does taste feature in this? It's something that wasn't discussed.
So this is the first question I was expecting. It's a question we'll get on a weekly basis at QMS, and it's a completely fair question. It's payment based on meat quality is something that we're looking to develop into this program. As Beth said, this resource is a living organism. We want to develop it as and when we can with the producers in mind, because it has to be guided, led by everyone else that's using it. Meat eating quality is absolutely something we'd like to look at. It's something that's been on the radar for an awful long time. I think it's been on the radar at QMS for about 20 years, but it's proven itself a very tough nut to crack, because first and foremost, if we're talking about eating quality, it's because we want to prove that the produce that we're supplying as producers is of a good quality. And the issue there is that we're relying on the consumer understanding what good quality is. And I think it's really, really difficult to pin down what the consumer wants, because if you're looking at it bluntly, you've got consumers who want two things, and there are consumers that want really lean, really red beef that looks appealing on the supermarket shelves, and there are people that want rich, marbled, fatty beef. Now, those are two opposite ends of the spectrum. I suspect, and I have no evidence for this, but I suspect there's a large chunk of people in the middle who are purely guided by what's on special offer and what's packaged nicely and what's on sale and what's being promoted well. So rewarding farmers based on meat eating quality is a difficult one. I'm afraid I'm not going to give any satisfying answers tonight with the looks of things, but first of all, establishing what meat eating quality is going to be hard. There are ways to do that. There are ways of analyzing intramuscular fat cover, minimum maturation times, but at the moment, payment grading systems, the Europe Grid, as Beth said, is a Europe-wide recognized tool, and it's universal because there's empirical data there to support that. Once we get into variables, it might change completely, and France's idea of top quality beef might vary from Italy's and might vary from Bulgaria or Ireland. So it gets a lot more subjective there, which makes it very difficult.
Another question is, what is QMS's values on grass-fed meat? Somebody's been speaking with local consumers and that the feedback is quite positive on that front. So where does QMS stand on the grass-fed sort of market?
I'm happy to take that one again, but feel free to correct me and chip in, Beth. Again, it goes back to that nice vague answer I gave about it depends on your production system. And there are places that are undoubtedly suited to grass-fed, grass-finishing, forage-based systems that take animals right through to the finishing line, forage-based. There are also great places that are utilizing concentrate feed or grains to get the best results out of animals to make sure that they hit spec. So it's completely down to the system. But yeah, the more we can utilize the natural assets of our farms, the better.
Perfect. What are the prospects for more consumer relevant carcass classification system? Would you envisage beef and sheep changing independently? And if so, first and how soon? Which first and how soon? Sorry, big pardon.
Sorry, repeat that a second. You cut out a little bit.
Somebody's asking, what are the prospects of a more consumer relevant carcass classification system? And what would QMS envisage beef and sheep changing independently? And if so, which would happen first and how soon?
Happy to let anyone else have a stab at that.
I suppose it goes back to what you just said there, Bruce. It's determining what quality is first and looking at all the work that's been done in the industry, and then how we go forward from there, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is there a classification system for goats as well? Because obviously it's beef and sheep that's primarily the the focus here, but is there one for goats, or is there going to be one for goats?
I honestly couldn't tell you, and that's testament to my ignorance. I've got a few friends that are quite heavily involved in the goat side of things and quite substantial goat units, and I should really know that, but I'm afraid I don't.
Something we can certainly find out. I mean, I'm the person that's asked the question there, and we can certainly find out somewhere if somebody is doing something somewhere. I don't know personally of anything with that as well. I don't know as much compared to beef and sheep and even poultry and things like that. I don't know much of a market for goat meat. I think that's a bit more refined and specialised. But we can certainly find out, or it might be that there's an opportunity there somewhere. I'll take another couple of questions and then we'll introduce our other speaker as well. Is there any plan to run the Meet the Market sessions post-lockdown? This person had previously inquired into one being run at Morrison's in Woodhead and Turriff, but it was oversubscribed.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be looking to run these workshops again, but we will only be doing so when it's safe to do. With these ones, because we're taking into farmers or stakeholders into abattoirs or food processing sites, so we really need to make sure they're running efficiently. So these workshops will probably be one of the later activities to get back as face-to-face meetings for QMS, but the plan is definitely to get them going again, because well, as you said, they're oversubscribed, there's demand, so we want to get them going as soon as we can.
Do QMS run any sort of this is just my own curiosity here as well, and I think this is a question that's been asked as well, if do you do something that specifically, various breeds, if somebody's completely new entrant, something like that, and they're trying to determine what kind of breeds they might want to consider for, and I know it varies between land and things like that, but knowing how one breed of sheep or cow sort of develops compared to another, is there any sort of workshops that you do with that, or any literature and that's available for that sort of thing?
We don't do a huge amount on breed selection as far as that goes. We do a bit of comparison through other projects we're involved in with other levy bodies. So I'm thinking specifically of RAM Compare, which looked at various metrics for different sires and the sheep side of things. And I know that Nicola's been heavily involved with that sort of thing as well. But no, we don't do anything specifically breed focused or making differentiating between one breed and another. We usually focus on essentially production systems and effectiveness of production systems as a general, rather than going into breeds.
Sure. Okay, I'll leave the questions there just now. I really want to introduce Nicola. I'll let Nicola say a bit about herself and what she does, and then if there's any technical questions, you can fire them at her as well.
Okay, thanks. So I'm Nicola Lamb. I'm a researcher at SRUC. So I'm based at the Hill and Mountain Research Centre at Curtin Ochtertyre, up in Creamlarif, although I've not been there for nearly a year now. But a lot of the work that we've been doing, mostly with the sheep flocks based down in Edinburgh and with industry flocks, is looking at some aspects of meat and carcass quality and ways to predict those. So it's interesting, and I think in a lot of these kind of seminars, there's always the questions about payment systems for meat quality that come up. It's a difficult one to measure, and I think particularly in lamb, it's not that easy to get an easy measurement of meat quality or predictor of meat quality, even at the point of cutting the carcass. So some of our research has been kind of based around that. So factors affecting meat quality, as well as how we can predict meat quality and carcass quality as well.
Perfect. So we'll open back up to more questions if anybody's got. I would love to hear actually anybody that's actually doing things at the moment and what you're doing, and if there's anything that we can maybe help discuss at this moment in time. You know, while we have the specialists here, if you've got any questions about your own setup that you're willing to share, and your own experiences as well, that would be great. Somebody is asking a question. This is for QMS again. What are your thoughts on the push for a reduction of emissions and incorporating this into QMS tools?
So yeah, I mean, reduction of emissions is something that we're gonna obviously be focusing on, as is everyone else, moving forward, because emissions is a headline, and it's something that we want to look at and drill down into what emissions are. Good emissions, there's obviously different types of carbon, there's different types of methane, there's ammonium nitrate, things like that. How businesses affect that. I mentioned we've got a Sustainable Red Meat Action Groups project that's just sort of finding its feet at the moment, and it's really looking at sustainability and reduction of emissions and how that affects the farm's overall sustainability. I think it's a difficult one to look at, and I think globally the picture for us emissions wise is probably not great, given that we're relatively high emission systems. I don't think that's a secret. I think it's good to look at emissions. It's good to reduce emissions. There are different projects ongoing with that. I know that SRUC are involved in some really interesting research on different diets, different emissions capture and technology, looking at the red meat sector. I think it's also probably worth looking at the environmental benefit of animals, and that's just through sequestration for a start, as well as looking at the biodiversity positives, because I think there'll be a lot more biodiversity positives in Scottish meat production than other meat production systems globally. So I think maybe that's what we should be looking to highlight, rather than just focused on emissions, but obviously they play an important role.
I mean, I'll add to that as well that, you know, it was talking about the SEC has a lot of research involved in that as well, but we also run software. So it's no secret that we do things called carbon audits for businesses as well. So that's separate in itself from perhaps specifically beef or sheep. It looks at the farm focus as a whole and sees where your emissions are actually more prevalent, or where you can make changes in your enterprise in order to mitigate perhaps some of the input that, like Bruce says, there's no secret that red meat it is quite a high emissions that comes from that, but it's not the overall picture. There are other things that happen on a farm, there are other things that happen in the system that sort of negate some of that impact, and that by doing a carbon audit, you paint yourself a bigger picture of what you can do in order to help balance that, or what you can do to change or reduce or increase, or whatever it is that you decide you want to do that ties with your business objectives, as well as your sort of desire to improve your environmental impact as well. So I mean, even though QMS have got their tools as well, there's a myriad of tools available and other information out there, and people doing various different work and you know, sort of collaborating together that will help sort of navigate you towards your end objective.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, the carbon audit is an essential part of any farm business. You know, in order to get a handle on what your emissions are and what you can do, and I see someone just pinged up there that it's hard to get an accurate interpretation. It's impossible to get an accurate interpretation of you know, a business, an industry standard, and to properly benchmark these things, because the data is variable, the businesses are incredibly variable, the outputs are variable as well. So it's difficult to find something that fits everyone nice and neat, but getting a grip of your figures and understanding your figures is a really, really important thing.
Becky has a question. She's raised her hand, so hopefully she's unmuted and she can ask away.
Hi, it's actually her husband. Can you hear me okay? So I'm Bruce, loving the discussion here. We have a small herd of pedigree Angus. We've started 3 years ago, and we're now at 8 cows and 8 calves. Our dream, because we're so small, we have to focus on something big, is we want to be grass-fed, sell grass-fed meat, pedigree meat. We're all over this net zero thing. We believe in it. It's the future. But we're also interested in, I've been following mobile abattoirs in other countries, and what's the implications in Scotland for that? And what my net zero goal would be is to have 0 food miles right to the very end, and then a premium to local customers, because I want to sell local as well. And if it has to go over 50 miles when I sell it to the consumer, they must pay a premium. So that's our goal. Goodness knows how we're going to get there, but I'm interested in this mobile abattoirs that is happening in other countries. Is there anything discussed in QMS about this, and what's the next step I could take? If you've got any advice, that would be great.
So the mobile abattoir discussion, I suppose, has been going on for an awfully long time. It's again a very difficult nut to crack with regulations and responsibility and liability and health and hygiene and all these things. And I suppose we've built a system around commodity beef and commodity meat, so there isn't the demand yet for. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. There isn't the demand yet for a mobile abattoir, and certainly the coverage that it would have to be looking at. But it's definitely on the radar. It's definitely being discussed, and if the appetite was there from processors or from customers, really, it would be looked at. Definitely. I'm sorry that's a vague answer, but it's a very small amount of people that are pushing for it, and it's a great shame that smaller abattoirs don't exist to fill that gap.
But there's always hope.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. And you know, to put a more positive spin on that, we've seen a real resurgence in people sort of valuing local provenance of food. And what you're saying is absolutely right, that people are looking, and they're more discerning now, and through COVID, they really embraced comfort foods and knowing where their produce came from. So that's a massive positive. And if we can build on that.
Definitely. Yeah. That's the market research I've done. I work in the oil industry, and it's all over net zero and all this caper. And we believe in it. And the people I've asked are totally determined on where their foods come from, and is it grass-fed? And it's very exciting. I just want to rub shoulders with the right people to make it happen, because I'm one of these guys that I'm going to do my best to see what I can do. I can't fail.
Yeah,
I'll learn. Anyway, that's enough from me. Back to you guys.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
More questions coming. There's loads flooding in, actually. Question here is, given that more cattle are coming from the dairy herd for slaughter and the poorer grades are inevitable, how can quality grass-fed beef producers get a premium for the market?
So that's a good question as well. Some great questions. They've really everyone's got their thinking caps on tonight and making it tricky. So I suppose that again stems from the customer, and it's encouraging that customer demand. So if I can spin it back to a different department in QMS, our marketing department is really leading on that, and really getting out there and getting that notification out there, so that Scotch beef, suckler produced beef, not necessarily specifically grass-fed, but suckler produced beef is out there and is being promoted by QMS as the healthy option. You've seen the marketing. I don't need to go over it. We had a campaign that reached I think it's 74% of UK households throughout 2020, and that's a fantastic achievement, and it's going to be in customers' minds there, and that's where that demand has to come from, because ultimately everything's guided by commodity and retail, or most things are guided by commodity and retail. So if we want to make a big splash and create a market where farmers are rewarded for producing suckler beef, it should be consumer led. And as I said before, finding out what the consumer wants is relatively tricky, but QMS are making inroads on that.
Excellent. Another question is, does the carcass classification differ for hogget, and why QMS doesn't appear to promote hogget as such? It's never mentioned commercially.
I'll pass the Beth for the carcass classification thing, but on hogget, there isn't a huge amount of consumer understanding on what hogget is. There's, I suppose, less consistency, less demand, and less product for hogget going about. And That might answer part of the question, but I'll pass back to Beth for a bit more information.
Carcass classification will be the same for all carcasses, so it will be still the Europe grid will still be used. Yeah, I think it just goes down to the name of the product still gets called lamb. It probably gets called old season lamb rather than hogget, perhaps. I think it's due to marketing and consumers just looking for lamb rather than their awareness of what hogget is.
Are there any management factors that affect marbling of meat for selling direct to consumer, or is this purely down to breed?
You want me to have a shot at this one? So quite a few of the studies that have looked at different breeds haven't found huge breed effects. More when they're looking at really diverse breeds like Scottish Blackface versus Texel or something on the lamb side of things. But breed can make a difference. So in those diverse ones, there's differences even in the muscle fiber types that you get within the muscle. But also things like diet, like what you feed them on is going to affect your meat quality, so, and how the plane of nutrition that they're on. So if it's a high plane nutrition for fast growth and a lot of concentrates, then that can change aspects of the colour of the meat and the firmness of the fat and things like that as well. The pasture, that's lower growth on pasture can give it a softer fat, and it can affect the flavour as well. Also things like avoiding stress and avoiding growth checks can affect meat quality. So particularly pre-slaughter, stress in the animals can have negative effects on the meat quality, and also growth checks during the season. So trying to keep them at a continuous growth rate. And then, as Beth said, I suppose selecting them at the right point with the right fatness and conformation grades will lead to better meat quality as well. You don't want them, I mean, the intramuscular fat is important, and the meat quality traits like the flavour, juiciness, tenderness do increase with intramuscular fat, but there is a point where that goes back down again. So if you get too much fat, even within the meat, that can have negative effects on the meat quality.
Perfect, thank you. Somebody's asking, this is another one for QMS as well. Somebody's saying that the QMS for the sheep and cattle scheme is really good, but is there any plans for QMS pork on a similar scheme to let smallholders show that they are aiming for higher quality pork and steering clear of the bigger pig farms? Is there something along those lines coming?
It's not something we've actually looked at, to be quite honest, but it's certainly something we could take a look at, and it should be it probably should be something that we try to get out there. I think it's really valuable to make sure that producers of all scales and all sizes are aware of, you know, the process, the marketing, and certainly for people coming into the industry, it's definitely worth supplying as much guidance as possible. So yeah, I'm quite happy to take that away and really have a look at that.
Perfect. Is dairy? Well, this is a good question. Is dairy? Is Scottish dairy beef not branded as Scotch beef? Is it? I don't actually know this one.
So, if it's 100% dairy, no.
Okay. That's fine. Perfect. Is anything going to be put in place for smaller producers for abattoir space? There's actually a few comments relating to this that seems to be near important with abattoirs closing and sort of private kills not being taken. It's getting very, very hard to sell direct. You know, what's the sort of understanding of abattoirs at the moment? What way is the wind blowing? What direction are we sort of going with being able to sort of help smaller producers in particular? Actually, I think because there's crofters and things like that here as well that seem to be struggling. And I know that some of the abattoirs up in Stornoway, things like that, it's only open for a handful of days a year and things like that, which is not good to anybody. What sort of information do you have for folk that are struggling with that at the moment?
So as I understand it, and I'm quite happy to be corrected on this by anyone, is that it's not necessarily abattoir capacity that's the issue. It's storage and it's freezer space and it's chill space that's the real issue. And certainly the bigger abattoirs are working on such volume and such throughput. They're working on very, very precise targets in what comes in and what goes out. And they're usually, well, they're all working at capacity at pretty much the whole time. I mean, if this is a question about right now, they're stretched beyond all possible belief. And they're, you know, we've got abattoirs now that are working Saturdays and Sundays, you know, putting kills through Saturdays and Sundays to try and make up for various issues that have happened throughout COVID, and, you know, reduce capacity for staff and things like that as well. But yet, chill space is the main issue, and that really goes down to, again, demand, and that's something that the individual processors have to look at and have to take up. But it's certainly something that prevents a lot of private kill and could certainly stand in the way of, you know, more direct selling, which is a real shame. But it's something that there are organizations out there looking at this. There are farm cooperatives that can look at this as well. And if there's any advice and guidance that QMS can supply, just don't hesitate to get in touch. We can try and certainly point you in the right direction on this. That's no problem at all.
I think we've covered most questions. I think the only thing is, I noticed that we've triggered a few comments about the carbon emissions and things like that, and obviously I've only scratched the surface of what we do with the carbon audits and things like that. But that's a whole other topic. That's a whole other meeting. That could be a large discussion as it goes. But one of the comments is that the carbon audits only concentrate on emissions. That's not strictly true. We look at where emissions come from, and we also look at, as the technology is developing itself, look at sequestration and things like that as well, and what the balance of carbon is within a unit, and not just where it's coming from, but where it's going back in again. But if you've got questions specifically with the carbon emissions things, this is more directed towards the production of meat and things like that. But from the carbon emissions part of it, we want to hear feedback from that as well. So please, you know, get in touch with us, send us an email, all that sort of stuff, and we'll refer you to somebody that knows a bit more about it than I do. I just know that there's a software system and I know how to use it. But you know, these questions are absolutely key, and it does tie in with what we're talking about. It's just a much broader spectrum than what we're aiming to discuss tonight. Any more questions, keep pinging them through. So in relation to that, to the dairy beef question, when is dairy beef not 100% dairy beef?
So I suppose what I was getting at is if it's beef sired, if it's sired by you know, a beef breed, or if it's dairy through and through. So you get, obviously there are different percentages. So if there's a one grandparent that's beef related, it can be 25% beef, 75% dairy, and then if it's one beef, one dairy, it could be 50-50. So that's what I meant by that. I meant by 100% dairy, as in Friesian and Holstein, or Friesian and Friesian.
Perfect. Another question here is, what can QMS do? And this is, I suppose this is true of a lot of places, but what can QMS do to get Scottish agriculture more time in Scottish Parliament? Surely due to a green recovery, it also means better grassland management and not just about trees for carbon, I suppose. Surely an acre of grassland captures more carbon than trees. That, again, that's going down the carbon route. I wouldn't like to hazard an answer of what's better, trees or grass. Certainly the question of, like, you know, what can agencies do to get more airtime for Scottish farming in Scottish Parliament? Is there anything that QMS can do? Are they doing anything just now?
So yeah, we're always doing things. Obviously, QMS are not a lobbying organisation. That's more the remit of NFUS, and NFUS do a great job of that. As far as getting information into Scottish Parliament, getting information into the hands of MPs and MSPs, we have a pretty active political side with QMS, just to provide industry updates, context, information on new technologies, new developments within the different sectors. Obviously, that's been key going right back to going back for years, but obviously that became really, really paramount for us going back to the start of COVID, and ensuring that the agricultural sector was represented, the processing sector was represented as far as that goes. And we did a huge amount of work with MSPs and got into meetings with probably every major MSP. We're now making a concerted effort, and I say we, I mean, it's been led obviously by our chair Kate and our chief exec Alan, but really been spearheaded from within the organization by our strategic engagement and external affairs department, that are making a real effort to reach out to more urban constituencies to make sure that they're aware. But I would say that with regards to the Scottish Parliament, we do have a fantastic amount of rural expertise in that Parliament. I mean, I could name a dozen active farmers that are part of the Scottish Parliament that are relatively high-ranking MSPs. So we've got that expertise in there, and what QMS does is just tries to make sure that they're aware of ongoing issues in the industry. And obviously, we've got Fergus Ewing, who's a really good champion of farmers.
I think one final question, and then we'll wrap up. We've covered a really good hour. Actually, this has been a very engaging session. But this question, I think I was expecting this a bit sooner, and I can expect this to be asked. But are there any of the organisations able to do anything about the blocking of genetically modified meat and imports, with the example of Brazilian beef being one of them? It's the genetically modified thing I thought would come up at some point. Interested to hear anybody's take on that one.
Yeah, I mean that all comes off the back of what I just said about our relationship with the politicians, and that's obviously, you know, having any control over what comes into the country or what goes out from the country is obviously within their remit, and all we can do is provide the evidence, provide the material facts to them to make that decision. Again, we're not lobbying a specific position. Obviously, it would be no secret to say that QMS is dead against any genetically modified beef coming in from countries like Brazil and things like that. We're aware also that we're not 100% self-sufficient, so we do need imports. That's a reality. It struck us in COVID last year, where we obviously had a real issue with carcass balance, where people returned to comfort foods and mince and steak mince and cuts of beef, and we obviously had some really high value cuts that were not being sold, and we had a shortage of mince. The decision was made by some of the processors to import from abroad. We obviously saw how that played out with the industry and the wider public, but we have to be aware that we're a country that is reliant on imports, and where those imports come from is down to the politicians. And I'm aware that that's a very political, dodge the question kind of answer, but we're not a lobbying organization. We don't make any public declarations like that, but we provide organizations that do with the facts.
Excellent. Well, I think I know that there's probably a few questions in there that we haven't been able to answer, but what we'll do is we will be sending out a summary after this meeting that will answer a few other questions as well if we haven't been able to do it tonight. Sadly, we just run out of time. It's a brilliant number of questions that have come in, very diverse, and challenged the panel a little bit as well, which is always good. Massive thank you to our QMS guys, Bruce and Beth, for joining us, as well as Nicola, getting a chance to answer some questions in there as well. I hope everybody found it very useful, and if you do want to get in touch with us, you can get in touch with us through the FAS website. Send an email there or give a phone, and you'll be directed to somebody that knows. So I'll bid you all good night, and thank you very much for joining us.